Kate Frances Wingard, and I live and work in Glasgow, in Scotland. It's pretty much like drawing images, making images, playing on software. I spend a lot of time just playing on my computer. And then I also work within the care sector as well. It's my money job. I think a lot of my focus has been a lot on kind of health and bodily systems in the past. I've got lived experience of illness. I work with people around these kind of subjects, which I think leaks into like the visuals that I use to more explore kind of like different forms of technology that I don't quite kind of like I want to understand. So I kind of like use it through like almost like use these kind of like metaphors in a way to explore that. And I kind of have always done that. I come from a more of a background doing like sculpture, and it was like photogrammetry, 3D printing that like led me into the kind of digital realm about 2-3 years ago. And then since then I've just like found that like there's so much more scope for creating within these realms, because you're not like, you're only defined by, which is a definitive, but you are defined by the kind of like parameters of the software in a way. But that is a lot easier than like the parameters of like materiality or something like that. So I think there's a lot more you can do in that kind of way. I think in a way that I try and look to frameworks that can be maybe more understood from different entry points. So it has like a language that might be preconceived. So that's why I've been using cards to kind of like play with that kind of the universality of the language of a set of cards in a way that people know their tools, people know how to use them, people know how to play with them, and like the suits are something that people understand kind of unanimously in that kind of way. And I think like in the past I've done the same, but I think it's because I also just use it. I just use my practice as a way to like understand things that I find really difficult to understand. I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone. I'm sure a lot of people do that. But like everything feels often quite wishy-washy and complex, and it's so. I find it almost like grounding to think about things in a like through like different mechanisms and that kind of thing. I change my image kind of quite frequently because I like to look at things for a really long time. That's what kind of like half what I spend doing in Blender is I'll model something and then sit and probably look at it for a month. It's a house that sits under a kind of this pylon, and it was like in the community that I grew up in, it was always like this kind of like myth that my mum definitely perpetuated within the community, and definitely different people kind of like spread it around, as well as that this kind of like pylon was affecting the people that like lived around it, and it was like causing all these like bodily issues that were kind of like changing like their like health or their kind of thing. And I've just been thinking about that a lot recently, because like it was just quite an interesting little kind of like story / anecdote to think about. I have like my screenshots that I need to go through, like things that I've collected when I've just been like online generally, and also things where I tend to take photos of notes. I lose them, or I bin them, or they like end up in different places. So it's good to kind of like use like digitalize them in that kind of way. I would never self-define as like a gamer or anything like that, but I'm really like, I enjoy it just recreationally, like so much. The first kind of thing was like when I first moved to Glasgow, I became really interested in the serious gaming department, like at GSA, and I like, it's a master's program, but I kind of just lurked around quite a bit, and I became quite interested in like I guess the overlaps of like where gaming was used in healthcare. And then it just kind of led me down this kind of like path into different things as well. With Heterogeneration, I kind of wanted to approach it like looking at the multiplayer and where kind of like game frameworks can be used to explore things, and just like conversational tools in a way, because that's I guess like the way that I've understood them. And I kind of like came to this idea of doing some form of game. And at first I was like, oh my God, I'm going to make like a whole game because I have like 3 months, like who am I? Like, yeah, Risk is a card game. It's a card game I used to play when I was younger, and the mechanics of it are quite simple. And then it has a lot of kind of almost new, I guess they call them mutations or modifiers or however you want to change it, where people have adapted the game in certain ways. So like I've been spending a lot of time on like Board Game Geek, watching people kind of play like this in these kind of ways. So this is actually the synchronized bidding mutator that I'm going to use in the show, and it's going to be like an adapted version of this. And the interesting thing is you can play it solitaire, you can play it two-player, you can play it up to like as many players as you want, and you can also then add this mutator on top of it, where instead of bidding against each other, you bid with each other, and each player needs to make their bid in the game. So essentially, I think it's interesting because it has those two different logics, and what I'm interested in within the gallery space is to look at how, by playing that and by having these relations across those two different kind of like rule frameworks, what kind of relations are formed, like how do players relate to each other in that kind of framework. I feel like I could work on things for years and years, and still I think it's the typical thing of the more you know, the less you know. But this is what the cards are based on, is that they're all based on almost like ideas to do with like distributed technologies like blockchain, for example, and the ideas of like the possibilities of the kind of relations that these could form and the kind of relations that these are formed upon, like consensus. And I was looking at the idea of permissions in these kind of systems, how developments in new technologies, especially within the blockchain community, is built on a very libertarian idea of the self. So like an idea that the self is an autonomous agent, and it in some ways erases a certain form of interdependency, which is quite maybe important when we're thinking about care and relating to each other. I kind of like simultaneously work on a couple of things, and I feel like these are only coming slow because I got very stuck in the aesthetics of them, and very stuck in the kind of like, why am I doing this? What is the meaning? kind of thing. And in a way, what they are is they're essentially just cards, just playing cards that are illustrated, and then each one of these leads into almost like a reader, in the same way that maybe tarot has a reader, or like different like forms of understanding have readers, which is way different to what I thought I was going to do. But isn't that just the way? Like, and they kind of all speak to these different dialogues, which I've been very influenced by this writer who talks about, can you do like good on the blockchain? Can you do good with these new forms of like like technology, which I think is quite interesting. And they use these tarot cards to kind of like as entry points into these quite complex ideas. And I was like, I guess that's what this is all about, is like finding some kind of like pinpoint in all this kind of smushy complexity into like almost like finding little portals into these discussions visually. The idea of play has always been like quite an important part of the way I think is that. And that's why I'm like the master of unfinishedness, because I'll play with something until I'm bored of it, and then I'll move on. You could call it a curse, some might say. But I think also it maybe comes from like a material practice as well, which I had when I was maybe younger, which was like testing, especially 3D modeling, 3D printing, casting, manipulating these kind of like objects within material forms, and then almost like relearning that in Blender or in like environments where you like simulate physics or you simulate like certain aspects of materials. My whole practice, I guess, is just playing with things to understand them. These kind of ideas into the project, where we could bring other people into it through modeling, through, as part of the project, I'm commissioning 4 different twine games from different artists with different backgrounds. I've got like Leo, who comes from a very painterly background, whose images that he made over lockdown we're gonna turn into a game together with my friend Seren, who's kind of like, we've been speaking a lot about kind of almost like the kind of like game-like aspect of her practice in collaging ideas together too. And then just a couple of other people. I understand things in one way, and what I wanted to bring into this exhibition, this is what I kind of pitched to Arbite, was this idea of bringing in many perspectives. the reason that I pitched a game is because I was quite interested in executing that within a gallery and seeing whether it would work. I mean, I've not been to a gallery the whole of 2020, so who knows whether it all kind of like, I've not seen art in a very long time in a physical space, but I'd be quite interested to see how this will work, and I'm like set up for it to kind of be tested and tried out. And I almost originally proposed a kind of game where you create the game while you play the game. So it was, and I was kind of thinking about the kind of like the play involved in failure and interrelation and interdependence in game mechanics and the idea of the multiplayer. So I think I came to Arbite with this idea of like wanting to explore what a multiplayer could be and how different systems kind of play into the way that we relate to each other. So this is my original proposal. I was going to originally call it Outdoor, which was from Shelley Jackson, who is this not first, but used hypertext in a really interesting way to do this thing called the Patchwork Girl. She wrote this thing called, I think it was MIT Press, called Stitch Bitch, where she kind of talks about ideas of like wholeness, especially to do with more so to do with like gender relations and stuff. These were my kind of original renders. I was going to originally have this kind of canopy style screen, but we kind of figured that it might look a bit funny with being able to project the Arbite roof does obviously not look like this. It's quite busy. And so we were like, maybe that wouldn't be such a good idea. So as part of the exhibition, I'm having these desktop computers here. These will be the Twine games made by the 4 different artists. I guess like what I see a lot online, like these kind of like networks and networked being is this idea that, you know, it's like a good thing as such, you know, like or not a good thing, but it's a thing that kind of like it's like this idea that we're all connected, we're all kind of like bound together in these kind of like and like I really like this this article by Gary Sexy Zhang because it speaks about the kind of seductiveness of that and what it hides behind its kind of like aesthetics essentially, because I think it can often be like quite romanticized. Like I see this everywhere, all over my Instagram and everything, this diagram, and for some reason it seems to kind of like make like decentralization and distributed networks in a way, then it's realizing that also like these kind of formulations have their limitations, because if they're built on the same kind of logics that decentralized systems are built on, then we're just kind of like creating like a decentralized capitalism, maybe. I don't know. And with the renders of the space, I've been working to create these kind of like side units. These all kind of have almost like I wanted to go for like a library style, because I think that's the way that I imagine imagine kind of the thought process in a way as like a collection. I'm not trying to kind of like solidify anything. I just kind of want to present like a collected kind of body of information in a way. And I was like, I think that's probably the point I'm at the moment, is just seeing things in this kind of like library form, which allow a visitor to kind of construct their own narrative into the space kind of thing, or like their own take on their own kind of like connections between things. So this was my original proposal. It's changed a lot because I realized that I kind of started to create this board game and way before I proposed this, which was to kind of do with this idea of like assemblage, and each was like a node, and you assemble in the same way that you would interrelate upon a kind of like different protocols. So I was looking especially at a gossip protocol. I wasn't really quite understanding it, and then it also became a bit interesting to think about how a person would encounter this in a gallery space or online or in any form of space and really be able to understand it and make it accessible. And the accessibility, the more I developed it, the accessibility came more and more almost difficult, I don't know, for people to understand. I do these collages too, which are really important to my practice, where I just kind of lay things on top of each other and look at it for ages. Because I can't really think outside of that. Another artist called Ismay Bright is developing mouse mats, which I just think are cool because they're such kind of like, I've got one here with me right now, and I just think they're such a forgotten, beautiful object. And then the illustrations are going to be done by like a really, and these are going to be for the backs of the cards, by a really close friend / just an artist I admire a lot, if I go right back to the beginning, called Amelia Kerr-Beale, who their work is all about, I guess, like kinship, which are the kind of things that I guess they're mainly important to me, that I don't want to get lost in, I guess, like this idea of like the technological sublime. I want to try and like make work that maybe can speak to like an idea of like friendship, kinship, care and relation in these kind of ways. I'm a bit of like a blender dweller, is that I'll model something and then sit with it for ages and just reuse it in different ways. The thyroid model that I modelled, I swear I modelled it like a year and a bit ago. Like, and I've just kind of sat with it for ages and been like, what should I do with that? This is just a file that I'm working on at the moment. I modelled this one as well, probably like, it probably was about 9 months ago, and I've just been sat with it. And I see Blender as almost like a game in itself because of the way the software is. Like, I think the nodes are just a game in a way. I don't know, it's like a really kind of important part of my process is that I essentially just play with these things. So this at the moment is a lymphatic system of the head, which I modelled because essentially, probably something that I should have mentioned is that I'm really interested in medical imaging and always have been when I was younger. So my mum and my father used to like work in the veterinary profession. And I remember very instinctively as a child developing x-rays and me helping him and my mum doing the same thing. And that's always kind of then played into my maybe like fascination with like the body as a distributed system and as like a framework for thinking about, I guess, like you think of the nervous system, it's like there's a kind of very common understanding of the nervous system works a little bit like the internet in a way and these kind of things. And there's like information, communication. Oh, this is another thing that I've been working on, which is this rock, which is using a PBR kind of texture. And this is the stapes, which is the smallest bone in the body, which is, I'm using it as kind of like a metaphor and for thinking about ideas of coordination, because it's incredibly important in the way that we perceive the world through not only sound, but also balance and the way that we kind of like, it changes the way that we understand the world through like our like kind of balance system, which is like the vestibular system, I think it's called. So I like simultaneously like have giving myself like at-home biology lessons and looking at images. Like I really am fascinated by like medical imaging in this kind of way. I'm currently also in the process of modelling a ganglion ring, which is in the process this year. It's pink at the moment because I was trying to be lazy and not do a procedural texture and just plop a photo on it, but it didn't work. So, I'm trying to think about the way that I can represent like the idea of forking or like changing direction and permissions and entrances through like this idea of like the kind of like the nerves within the body in that kind of way, and the way that they like change and kind of like, yeah. And I think they just have like they speak to something visually there that I'm maybe not so great at communicating. Some of the things I think you can see my work process through, because I will often start with like a tutorial. Like, for example, this one came from a tutorial in like Vines, and then I modified that into what I understood as this using reference images. I feel a little bit weird doing, to be honest, this whole thing, because like I see a lot of like my practice just come from the people around me, and I'm sure that's definitely not unusual, but I'm very like dependent upon those people around me, like Rebecca and Colin and everybody who have been like really big influences, I guess, on the way I've been thinking. And I guess the only thing I wanted to talk about was for Collective, me and Rebecca, which it really, I think, like it was really small. It was like a really small show, but it became a really like important, maybe one of the best things that I've ever done, really. Because it was this kind of like sound work in which we use motion sensors to essentially adapt the sound. And this was after I'd kind of been doing a lot of sound production stuff. Me and Rebecca kind of came together, and she's very technical, and we like built this kind of like piece where around the space there were these kind of like motion sensors which altered the way that you inhabited the space as the viewer. And it had this level of interactivity because we did it upon volume mapping and pitch mapping. So as you moved around the space, you'd alter the mix in different ways. We were working in these labs in Edinburgh at the time, and we were thinking about like slime intelligence and all of these kind of like other forms of like beings that redefine, I guess, the self in that kind of way. And it was in this tiny little basement in Nottingham, and it was honestly, one of the best experiences. So I just thought I'd talk about that because it's changed the way I think about practicing a lot, which is because it just felt like a communal process, which it was really, really lovely. I've always felt that maybe there's a split between my life with like working and making, and I think this year it's been really good to be able to think about both things. Having like another form of job and labour is actually really important to me, and it's actually really like a big part of like the way that I can kind of like think and be in that kind of way. And also it's just been a really nice way to kind of like also see the people around me. There's like lots of different people doing very different things in Glasgow, and it's been a really nice opportunity to watch different people's practices evolve in different ways, learn more digital stuff really. Oh, and also I built a computer. That was the funnest thing I did. That was the best part of it all, was I like saved up over the summer after graduating and bought myself like a full-on, like, you know, I built it and I did all the like PC part picker kind of stuff, and then I got really into it and built a couple of like slowly kind of builds off Gumtree and did a bit of like side hustling with selling them on Gumtree as well, kind of thing. So that was fun. I want to keep learning more of the technical side of things in a way that's not self-taught. That's what I see personally, like the future holding is that I quite like to do some form of like, I want to essentially learn more about computing, because I think I inherently quite like problem solving, and that's what it is in a way. It's all just this like big kind of like problem solving, but with the work itself I quite like to keep developing it with other people, and maybe start like working with other people who maybe like haven't necessarily used open source softwares and helping to introduce them to it. I think a big part of what I see in all of this is like some form of accessibility, and these interfaces are almost like game interfaces, and when you start to like also understand code, it's like learning a language. It's like another way of communicating. I see a lot of great work being done around helping people understand, I guess, like the uses of their like data and what that means for themselves and the way they navigate society. And I think that's really important too, and that I quite like to look into in the future. But in regards to the art thing, I'd quite like to do something locally, because that'd be really important for me, is that because this work isn't going to be able to be seen by lots of people who have helped me / contributed / put up with me moaning. And so it would be amazing for it to be able to be locally developed as well. It's like another iteration, because it will just evolve. Like nothing ever is ever finished, is it? Well, not for me anyway.